All right. I'm Adriana Helbig. I'm an associate professor of music at the University of Pittsburgh, where I'm also an assistant dean of undergraduates. And the book that we're talking about today is Hip Hop Ukraine: Music, Race, and African Migration. And you mentioned the internet, and that's actually how I really got into this, because the book cover, which has a representation of three musicians from East Africa. I came across those pictures on the internet during the Orange Revolution. And so these are musicians that have been active in Ukraine for more than 10 years. They've been very much part of pushing migrant identity alongside pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western political discourse. And so this is what we're going to be talking about today. So I was a graduate student working in Western Ukraine. I was doing a dissertation on Romani music, so working with NGOs, looking at how gypsies use music to draw attention to political discussions, to human rights issues, to equality in Ukraine. And this was leading into the Orange Revolution. So I'd started that research back in 2001, and so I was in Ukraine during the Orange Revolution in Western Ukraine, in Zakarpattia, in Transcarpathia, which is actually a very interesting political region in and of itself, because you don't ever really know which way they're leaning with that. And so during that time, there was a group called Chornobryvtsi, two men. One was from Jamaica and the other one was from East Africa, and they were on stage. So remember how the musicians were very much on the forefront of those revolutions. And so looking at that, and I thought, well, this will be my next project. So while I was finishing the Romani dissertation, I also applied for funding from the Department of State here in America. And at that time, the U.S. Department of State actually had a hip-hop ambassador. And basically, the proposal that I put forward is that hip-hop is somehow connected to political discourse in Ukraine, and 7 grants came through, and I started that research, and that's pretty much how it happened. So that's been an ongoing thing. So I've now traced a lot of their families to East Africa. I actually traveled to Uganda. I've been participating with the musicians in Eastern Ukraine, in Kyiv, in Western Ukraine, and just seeing, really how the number of migrants has risen in Ukraine, and how the discussions are now affecting human rights issues for everybody there. So it provides a lot of overviews, and a lot of this was very new to me as well. My biggest question is, why would students, or why would Africans move to Ukraine and then start to choose to live there permanently? Because many of them have chosen not to return back home. And is Ukraine a welcoming place? And if so, then is it equally welcoming to those who are musicians? Because at this time, everyone in Ukraine is very much into everything out of the West, right? So hip-hop as this quintessential African-American music genre is one that everyone was very familiar with, especially during the Orange Revolution when people were rapping, and this has been very much one of the main genres of the world. And so looking at hip-hop, I did a few things. The first is I do trace the history of hip-hop in Ukraine. It's predominantly in eastern Ukraine that it started. So when we're looking at groups like Tanok, Maidani, Kongo, they're coming out of Kharkiv. And so I went to Kharkiv, and this is where many of the African musicians that I worked with are based. I also started to work with underground hip-hop musicians, so looking at the commercial hip-hop industry in Ukraine, and then the underground hip-hop industry, which is actually a little bit different, and looking at the role that Africans play in this situation. And one of the things that I did find is that many hip-hop areas, or many scenes within Kharkiv, within Kyiv, they actually ask for help from a lot of African musicians, because those that are coming in are actually much more on a higher economic level. So they have more access to technology at that time, and they were able to give more information as to how hip-hop is supposed to sound. And then when we're looking at the conflation of Western music genres and the the Ukrainian music industry not being as it is now, for instance, 10 years later, we have sort of a conflation of stereotypes. So when I was asking around for African musicians in Kharkiv, basically they were saying, oh, the African Americans, yeah, they live down the street. And I said, well, African Americans. So there was a blurring of identities. So it's not African. It's actually automatically assumed that they're African American. And they're presented as that even in the media. So when they're introduced on stage, they tend to say Afro-Amerikansi. So what is that conflation then about? And it comes together in hip-hop because, again, hip-hop more than any other music genre is associated with African Americans. But hip-hop in Africa sounds very different than hip-hop in the States, right? They're being influenced by reggae. They're being influenced by Cuban music or from colonial music genres. And so now all of a sudden, this is all now coming together in Ukraine, right? You've got music that's coming in through the internet and through actual music that they've been listening to from the U.S., plus this African-influenced, and then their own versions of it. So it's a really fascinating scene. And you can really learn a lot about what's happening in society just by listening to the music, just by listening to them on stage, how they interact with the audience members. So Africans get much more stage time as DJs and as MCs in a not even just a hip-hop club, but now in most clubs. And again, because of that stereotype. So that the stereotype that African Americans as musicians, Black, English speaking, and now they're on stage in Ukraine. And it's very hard to unpack. It's very hard for people to unpack that they're actually not African Americans or from someplace else. Well, hip-hop, when we're talking about hip-hop, we're talking about hip-hop culture. So anything that involves rapping, you have breakdancing as part of this, graffiti comes into this. In Ukraine, it also joins in with scenes like BMX biking. So it had to do more with an elite expression of identity. If you were familiar with hip-hop, that meant that you had access to products from the West. And again, it's very hard to talk about this now post-Euromaidan when, everybody has Twitter and everyone's connected and there's a very different thing happening now in the last 3-4 years. But when you're going back to when this research started, those that were involved in this scene, it meant that they actually had some kind of connections to people in the United States, and they were using that to socially elevate themselves or to present a more cosmopolitan identity. And Kharkiv is very much a logical city for this to have happened. So when we're looking at, again, a group like Tanok, the Maidani, Kongo, like how did they actually get started? A part of hip-hop aesthetic is a very impoverished rural aesthetic. When you're looking at the history of hip-hop here in the States with the South Bronx, you have a marginalized group, politically, economically, socially marginalized group that's using this music really as a way to collectively, entertain themselves in a way. There's a political element, but also entertainment element. When it gets to Kharkiv, the images, especially the early hip hop images, they're coming from those newer buildings, right? The spalni rayony, the edges of town. You have a lot of young men that are unemployed at this time, and they're also using each other to, elevate themselves socially, to give themselves an identity. There's a very strong no alcohol, take care of your body part of this as well. And here it's, you can't be on drugs and breakdance. I mean, that's, you know what I mean? And this was also a pushback against, if you're thinking of Ukraine in the mid-1990s, right, it was a very, very difficult time. And when you're looking at Kharkiv, though, you still have a much more cosmopolitan turnover of the population, right? You have all the universities, which never really lost that flow of people coming to study, right? So if you're thinking of medicine, right? So you have a huge Vietnamese population, there are Chinese population. It's very different, for instance, from Lviv at that time especially. So Kharkiv, this cosmopolitan, constant moving element to it. And so it's not unusual that then hip-hop starts there again with that group. And then you have them winning a national competition in 1997. And then from there, that's starting to spread like, oh, we can actually rap in Ukrainian. And there's different understanding as to, how rap in Ukrainian works and how rap in Russian works. Sometimes they'll code switch, so they'll say more aggressive things in Russian, then go more towards the lyrical Ukrainian. And where the Africans fit in, many of them are Ukrainian language based. They're doing this in Ukrainian for political reasons. But then they also have a repertoire in Russian because many of them are Russian speaking. They've learned Russian in Africa and they're following the footsteps of their fathers and uncles and, where they were still under the Soviet system getting education in places like Kharkiv. So that's actually how they're following that migration. And I mention men because the migration tends to be still quite male. I learned many things. The first thing that I learned about Ukrainians, older Ukrainians are actually very welcoming. So you don't get the sense of racist discourse among the population that was growing in the Soviet Union. They tend to talk about friendship of the peoples, this kind of discussion that's still very, very much, especially in eastern Ukraine, you can still hear that among the older population. But the younger population, I really was often shocked at what they would allow themselves to say, but not just about Africans, but just about anybody. And it was part of that whole discussion that you hear about migrants, that they're coming in to take our jobs, that kind of thing. But there was also a very striking similarity of the type of discussions that I would hear about Roma, about gypsies, that they smell, that they look, that they're dangerous, that they're dark. So there was that type of thing. However, that said, when you're remembering that the migration is predominantly male, right? So mostly male elite Africans are coming into Ukraine to study. It's not necessarily women. So then you have groups of young Black men, and, that's a very vulnerable identity, not just in Ukraine, but just about anywhere. I mean, racism, when you're thinking about discussions like that, they actually spread very parallelly across the world. And music, again, is a big part of how that comes about. And I'll explain that in a minute. But so a lot of these young men were looking to these hip-hop recording studios as ways to fit into society. So they were using them actually as physical protection, almost in a way, like they would, so that you're not walking down the street alone. While the other guys were saying, great, so do you want to be our DJ? Do you want to be part of this? What do you know? What can you help us? And so it became this very interesting relationship where both were helping. And then these guys that were owning these hip-hop studios were very instrumental in changing perceptions towards Africans. And again, post-Euromaidan, we see a very different discussion because now on the basis of 10 years of Africans appearing on stage in Ukrainian costumes. And honestly, Ukraine is the only place where this happens. You don't see this in Poland. You don't see it in Bulgaria. I mean, you have African students in all post-socialist countries. But in Ukraine, when they wear the vishuvka and then they're on stage and they're singing their song, something happened in those 10 years. And so there's this way, especially post-Euromaidan, that the attitudes are like, it's somehow normalized. And again, we can't make a stereotype about everybody. And it's very almost dangerous to say, younger Ukrainians, older Ukrainians. When I was doing research, I was very much in the towns, in the bigger cities. And there's, again, a very different reaction when you see somebody and this is just the normal thing and then they get used to it and then they're over it, versus in a village where maybe there's an unusual situation, right? And maybe not that much access to it. But now that they're on TV, again, it's a very normalized thing. The one caution I have about that is that yes, we are now not overtly saying anything negative about especially African migrants and people who are chosen to live in Ukraine. They're very much in support of Euromaidan and a lot of the ways that Ukraine has changed since that time. They're very supportive of the war effort. But it seems we are still only comfortable with them when they were the Vyshovka. It's like, okay, now you have the Vyshovka, so now you're one of us, now you know where we are. And I think where we need to constantly remind ourselves and work towards this human rights issue and this idea of citizenship, that everybody should have equal rights and that Africans should not have to go through, I mean, you can't imagine, again, how complicated these systems are to get a passport if you're new to Ukraine. And a lot of these people simply don't even know how to help themselves get situated. So we do need to give them a helping hand. There's an African center. There are organizations that help them. Churches are very active. African churches are very active in all of this. But still, we need to, ideally what I would love would be to turn this book into a cartoon. And these ideas of bringing accessible readings for school children and just have programs in the schools, because that's why the older generation doesn't have these issues, because it was constantly part of the Soviet rhetoric. It was in the schools. We are one big happy family in a way. I mean, there's problems with all of that too, right? But the way that it played itself out is that it wasn't this overt physical violence that we saw, 10 years ago. Well, I think there's a very strong idea that with Ukraine turning towards these European values, that there is a very strong desire to stay and to become part of the Ukrainian fabric. That's what they're saying. There's also a great fear, though. So especially, many of them are in eastern Ukraine, where all of the violence has been. So there were months when people didn't leave their apartments. They were absolutely petrified. They didn't go to demonstrate on the streets because they said, I absolutely want to support some of these political happenings, but if I go on the street, I'm the first one that's going to get targeted because I look so different. And that was one thing that I learned from doing interviews. So, I didn't have the opportunity to spend that much time in these cities. So I would try to set up interviews in the center of town, and I would, in a coffee shop or somewhere in the center where I could access everything that was happening. And they just overtly asked, they said, no, can we be outside? So that was one thing. Can we meet outside, not inside in a coffee shop where everybody is then looking at them? And the second is, can we meet on the outskirts of town so that it isn't this ability, right? I mean, this is just the most basic thing. And so I would then try outside, and it was mostly just not to be in the center of town, and where they feared to walk alone. Initially, it's the university system. So they were going to study, but there was already a population there that had studied under the Soviet Union. And under the Soviet Union, you were supposed to go back, right? So the visas didn't stay. But there was that group, of course, that was in Kharkiv and in Kyiv and in Odessa when everything fell apart. And so they decided to stay, thinking that they could, ride the wave of economics going up. And unfortunately, many of them lost much of their money. They lost their papers. And so there's actually a population that's stuck, quite honestly. They don't have the economic backing. They don't have paperwork to even get out of Ukraine. And those are the people that need our help. Well, I knew you were going to ask me that, and I cannot say an actual number. I mean, there's a few thousand, but, part of it when you're thinking of who's documenting whom, that's not one thing that I can actually comment on. I'll just back up a little bit. So when you're thinking of the Soviet times, there was a lot of love, right, and which resulted in children. Those children they tend to be referred to by the word mulat. The thing is that because it was actually mostly African men that were studying in the Soviet Union and they had to go back because of visa restrictions, most of these children never really got to know their fathers. So there is a movement now, and many of these people are actually on television. Some of them are big figures. So it's been very publicized to go back to Africa, to meet your father, to meet your father's family, to kind of have these very public reunions. It tended to be that these children were often sort of skirted off to a grandmother in the village. So many of these young people were actually growing up not in the cities. They were growing up far away. But all of these people have now migrated into cities and they are DJs. So you have a group of mulat DJs. Then you have those that came that are already married or are meeting Africans in Ukraine. So there's an interesting thing of choosing names where they are going towards the Ukraine. It's very interesting, where they don't choose the African names, or the African name will be now the middle name, and the first name is like Odarko, Natalia, or someone like that. And then you do have the intermarriage. Now that's a little bit rarer, just because those the biracial couples do experience a lot of violence. So when you have an African man and a white Ukrainian woman, there tends to be an attack on the man. Now, there is an interesting thing that's happening, though, because up to now I've been talking about East Africans moving into Ukraine, but there's now a movement out of West African, the French-speaking parts of Africa, because that migration used to always go to France. And when you're thinking of the politics of France and you're thinking of anti-immigrant discourse in Europe, they're pushing eastwards, starting to see them more in Ukraine. And so then how are they then negotiating these two very different colonial histories? And they're playing it out in these hip-hop clubs, right? So now it's like you've got times where it says, okay, now you've got an English language DJ coming in and you've got the French language DJ. And then what are the politics of using the colonial language? Why not use then the local African languages? Why not Swahili? So where does this start to fit in with the hip hop that they're listening to? Well, the people that I work with are all legally in Ukraine. So many of them have gotten there simply through this student visa channel or now on business relationships. So that's what we're talking about. But when we're talking about immigration, what you're referencing, there's been a long history out of Senegal, for instance, where we do constantly see, the attempts to make it on boats to the European continent and then, boats of 40, 50 people tipping. It's just that it hasn't made it into the media in Europe as much because they never make it as far as the European borders, right? So when they flip, they're flipping right outside of, the African continent. And it also, there's a very different, the racism is still as overt as we can say, and there's a very different reaction in the media when a white child dies and when a black child dies. And that's something, again, that we're constantly having to think about. And people will say, I'm not a racist. Well, you don't actually have to hurt somebody, or you just have to catch yourself when you're doing this. And this was very difficult for me as well, too, catching my own self, and dealing with a lot of ways that I was raised. So I grew up in an African-American neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey. The Ukrainian church was smack in the middle of a black neighborhood, and it was like tunnel vision. It was like, well, now we're going to church, and now we're going to the Ukrainian butcher, and now we're doing this. And it's like everything kind of didn't exist or somehow wasn't part of our world. And then the interesting thing is also that immigrants moving here to the States, they pick up on that, right? They understand that social mobility, like something about blackness is not right here in the States, thinking of 1950s, right? When our parents came, and then how does that then play itself out in the home and in school and everything else? But I think when you're thinking of social mobility, I constantly have to remind people that we were able to do this. We were able to become middle class because we were white. And that is the number one factor. And when you're looking at U.S. history, you know, the racist discourse is so strong. And one of the reasons I acted so strongly to this, I mean, think of also as a graduate student, right? The logical thing for me should have been that I then write the book on Roma, I then apply for jobs on Roma. But this struck me as so unusual that two things from my life that I never thought should or would or could ever come together. You have an African person wearing a Ukrainian vishivka. To me, I couldn't wrap my head around it. And I said, okay, that's it. We have to figure this out. And I realized that I was also putting my own stuff with that. Now, going back, though, like thinking of the history of Africans in Ukraine, when you actually unpack that, there's a very fascinating going back even pre-Soviet. Like there were African Americans that were having relationships with the USSR, and they were very much into communist discourse. And that history is silenced in the States. So African-American relationships with the USSR are very much like not talked about. So that is in the book, and that was all very new to me. So I had a lot of students, and we use this as a teaching tool, and we talked about this in seminars, and they helped me with some of that research. So if we're thinking of Ukrainians and African Americans, we go to Taras Shevchenko and Ira Aldridge. So that there was a friendship there. Yada Arts Group actually has a piece about that friendship and about the name. I was just Googling the name of that. I'll find the name of Virlana Tkach's interpretation of this. But basically, yeah, that's as far as we would go. And they've used Taras Shevchenko's sketchings of Ira Aldridge, to say that this goes back, and the surf songs and the experience of being a serf and the experience of being a slave are aligned. So that is one of the discussions that I actually see, and I've talked to Africans, and I say, why did you move to Eastern Ukraine? What is this thing that moves you about Ukraine? And a lot of the discussion of persecution, this idea of language also, because think of all the languages that were destroyed in Africa, identity, culture, hunger is a big thing too, like famine, where they identify with the Holodomor. That's a very, very strong identifying factor. So it's extremely powerful. And I hope that, this book inspires students to say, okay, we can talk about Shevchenko. We don't always have to do it the way that the generation before us did. We can find different ways into history as we become comfortable talking about Ukrainian history in a different way. And it's a very difficult thing to do in the humanities, right? Because in the humanities, we almost charge ourselves with this responsibility that I am going to build up the story. I'm going to bring attention to things that have been silenced in Slavic departments or in academia in general, or the corrected information. But the idea of the humanities is to be critical. It's to unpack. It's to break the story. It's to find cracks and to get into it. So how do you build and crack at the same time? And that's something that in my career I've really struggled with, but it's been really one of the most fascinating and challenging things. And when you've angered someone, then you've done something. Well, I am personally fascinated by the part of the story that involves African Americans moving to the USSR. People like Paul Robeson, who had musical experiences, giving concerts, singing in Russian, then being politically destroyed here in the United States for those associations. And yes, we have to understand that these were very much official tours that people, were being brought to Moscow and they were being told a certain thing. But the fact that they believed in that rhetoric, that they believed that that communism could offer an escape from the Jim Crow South, that to me was a powerful thing. I also love to hear about like in Eastern Ukraine, there are stories of laborers, people who were already working in the factories in the early socialist system in the 1920s and 1930s, who started to protest and fight for African American equality. So there are examples of that where you have politically active laborers in Eastern Ukraine who are saying no to lynching, no to the electric chair, no to the exploitation under the Jim Crow laws. And that again, that's a fascinating history. Well, here's what I think. It has nothing to do with, it really has to do with silencing histories. And it's a very easy way to do it if you simply omit detail, right? And so now you've now retold the story without that detail, and now somebody thinks that the story is this. And it's only when you unpack and going into the archives and being able to really piece it together, that's where pop media research, even though people dismiss it, so everybody knows how to read it. Yes, you know how to read the media of today. You absolutely understand what Twitter is, what these kinds of memes are. But you have to understand it, what these cartoons and what these media examples were like in the 1920s and 1930s. If you can understand how people were reading that back then you can understand what the mentality really was. They themselves are studying themselves, right? So that's a very important thing to throw into this, that you have older Africans that are political leaders, that are cultural leaders, religious leaders, who are now collecting data on who's there to represent the communities. The danger, again, that I say to that is, let's not just throw this onto these political leaders. That our leaders have to be very much involved in incorporating these people. This book actually got great reception. I've presented in Lviv and in Kyiv. So young people are very, very much into this. And again, it builds onto the Euromaidan discourses of equality, civil liberties. And so I'm not too concerned about that. Where I'm concerned about is getting this into literature, like, the Ukrainian studies literature, where this doesn't actually fit, right? There's no model that I'm building on from somebody. This isn't folk music research, right? It doesn't fit into that. Just think about it. When you're doing a history project, just think, okay, like I'm talking about these people. Well, who have I missed? Have I missed anybody? And so you yourself have to think constructively and to recognize that there are people that are consistently silenced in history. And it's up to you to be socially conscious and to find those threads. And they're not obvious at all, right? They're not obvious at all, because the story is very, very rich. Going back, it's not that this just happened, right? This is happening now based on hundreds of factors that have built in, over the last century or more. One of the reasons why I published the book through Indiana University Press is because of this ethnomusicology multimedia series that they have, which allowed me to upload all of these videos onto their website. So anybody that's reading the book can access all of this. And I don't think you even need to buy the book. You can simply make a password and ID for yourself onto this Indiana University page. One of the most important things, again, about that is that it looks deceptively simple. It looks like it's fun, right? These are people that are singing Ukrainian folk songs, dressed in Ukrainian costumes on a horse, doing a video in a village, talking about kozaki and love and else. But it's so rich, right? Like, think about how did this happen? I always said, if I could figure that out, I would get tenure, right? Like that was, it's taking me years, 10 years. And even now it's, my goodness, how much we couldn't put into the book, or how much we rewrote the story, because you don't want to finalize the story. There's no conclusions, right? It's people's lives. They change every day. Things happen. The political system changes, and boom, now we're in a whole nother thing. One of the things that I wanted to do with those websites, though, is to give that historical lineage. So you do have Soviet cartoons where you can actually see representations of Africa, how Africa was imagined by the Soviet Union, because remember that this is the Cold War. The Soviet Union is trying to go after the natural resources and all the colonies just as much as the U.S. is, which is, again, why people like Paul Robeson, they had to choose. African Americans had to be on that American side. If you're a true American, you're with us. It doesn't matter that being a communist would be helpful for you if you're black, right? And so the Soviet Union played these African nations, and that's where, again, all of these people were coming into the USSR with free education, right? The idea was to go back to spread socialism and to create those connections with Russia. Now, the interesting thing about the cartoons, though, is why is it Africa is never presented with people? So Africa is always a little island. It always has animals. And then if there are people, they're represented in a caricatured way, which is indicative of blackface. So they're playing with, they're using actually U.S. stereotypes of African Americans to represent Africans. You know, there comes this point when you're so marginalized, where among themselves they talk about this very much, right? And I'm not going to even speak about African Ukrainians, say African Americans. You ask an African American family and a white family, how often do you speak about race? And the white family will say, you know, when something comes up. The African American family will say every day, right? Because when you are the ones that are engaging with this, you have to find ways to maneuver through all of this. So that's pretty much where we're at with that. But they are now pushing back, and they're trying hard to just to find ways to say, look, like, you have to be human about this. You can't constantly, talk about Africa as this, I think reading this book, it's a very accessible book. I gave this to many different people as I was writing it. So it's accessible to a student. It's accessible to someone who's a non-academic, but also someone who's an academic can find the resources that they need within it to piece the story together. And I think that as you're reading this, simply do a check on yourself. So it's as much a book about what's happening as it is about giving an opportunity for yourself to process all of these ideas, because this is exactly what it was for me, that it was an internal search, and I do paint my own story into this as well. And I simply encourage those students who are coming after me to be bold, and just if you find something small. This was literally set off by a picture that I found on the internet that resulted in a 10-year project funded by the government, by the universities, and it resulted in a job at University of Pittsburgh. In a way, it was from that one picture, and I surfed it on the internet and just followed the story. Follow the story everywhere that you go. That's all I can say. When Euromaidan happened, the natural thing was to do something, right? But when you're doing research in Eastern Ukraine, it's actually not that simple, because the story at the time was joining the EU, and you're working with people that don't really want to join the EU. A lot of people on the hip-hop scene are also, their economics are based with St. Petersburg, right? The music scenes are going towards Russia. So I didn't get involved. I did do a hunger strike, though. And so that became my response to it, and simply to say, like, a 1-week-long hunger strike against violence, and that was it. But I tried, in a way, you won't find me making overt political on what actually happened there, because it really is very complicated. And I think that's, if we can somehow move ourselves back from this black and white, you're either or, you're either pro-West or pro-Russia, Ukrainian or Russian, then that would be more truer, I think, to life in Ukraine. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you for finding the work, and I appreciated sharing it, and we'll see what happens in the few years as people read this and get inspired to do new things. Bye. Bye.